So what we're going to be looking at for the next hour is a discussion on the Studio Display Glyph and how we can actually create reports from our results when we do a process in nCode. The agenda today is going to follow these 5 bullet items here. First, we're going to talk about what Studio is. Then we're going to get into a little more detail about displaying objects and how we can manipulate those. We will configure our reports. And once we've set all that up, we're then going to look into how we can export these reports. And I'll wrap things up with a demonstration at the end inside of nCode. So we've got a couple of bullet items here discussing some features that are going to help us understand what Studio is. Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can access Studio. There is certainly a preferred way, and that is by making use of the Studio Display Glyph. You can see a screenshot on the left. The Studio Display Glyph is on the Display Glyph palette, and the typical procedure would be that you have most likely already started a process. You've got perhaps an input glyph, you have some glyphs that are doing some analysis on your data, and then you would bring the Studio Glyph in. And this Studio Glyph is going to start off as a blank glyph, but you would then begin to insert objects into that, these objects being analogous to many of the display glyphs that you've already become familiar with. Studio is very configurable, so you're going to see that you have a great deal of control as to how you're going to manipulate these objects, their size, their position, a lot of their formatting. And within the report as well, we're going to have a great deal of customization available to us where we can summarize our information on one or multiple pages, and then we can output these results in a number of different common file types. Some typical examples would be images or Word documents. The Studio Display Glyph can have a lot of different types of objects inside of it, and here is a list of those. So we can insert FE display objects, GPS display, histograms, images of several different file formats, the common ones being bitmaps or JPEGs. We can create tables, text boxes. These text boxes can have static text as well as information containing metadata so that we can begin to populate that text in an intelligent way. We can do waterfall displays, several different types of XY displays, just like the XY display glyph would, and also 2 different types of XYZ displays. The general process for creating these objects within the Studio Display is all going to be done via right-click functionality, which we're going to get into as we configure it. But you can see in this upper right image, we have Studio Display Glyph, and the user has right-clicked on it. It brings up a contextual menu where you can then navigate to Insert. And from there, you have a list of all of these objects that we just saw here in the bullet items. Let's talk a little bit about how we actually configure a report. You can think of these reports as being built on a piece of paper. So here in North America, 8.5 by 11. It starts off blank. We can put any number of display objects on those. They can be repositioned, resized, and we can manipulate the way in which they look as well to a great degree. The image that you see on this screen right here is just a sample shot of what kind of report you might be able to create, and we can see a variety of different types of objects here. One of them, the very first display, the upper left one, would just be what appears to be raw strain gauge data. Then we have a number of other glyphs, display objects, I should say, on this report that show things like rainfall cycle kind of data and also a PSD. So those are just a few examples of what we could create on a Studio report. So let's take a look at a couple of steps that we should follow when we're actually building a report. We've got 5 steps, and the first one's pretty simple. We're going to take the Studio Display Glyph, and we're going to drop it into our process. So as I mentioned earlier, you've probably already started building your process. We can see that is the case here, where we've got a time series input glyph, And then we have 3 glyphs attached to that, which are all going to be doing some type of analysis on our time series data. So it looks like we've got amplitude distribution, rainflow, and then frequency spectrum glyph. And as I mentioned earlier as well, the studio display glyph to start with is going to be blank, and there will not be any input pads along the left-hand edge. That's all about the change, though. We can go into the studio display glyph, right-click, and begin inserting objects. So it looks like the user is about to insert an XY display object of time series data. And as soon as we've done that, we're going to see an object appear, and we're also going to see pads begin to appear on the left-hand edge. Once we've started populating that page, we'll probably want to begin configuring the page. We'll also want to configure the objects as well. So you can, on the same contextual menu, right-clicking anywhere in the white space of the Studio Display Glyph, select Properties. That's going to bring up a dialog box that we see here, which would allow us to do things like control the margin and specify if we want to do a landscape or a portrait orientation on our report. A couple more things regarding configuring the objects in the page. Once you've put an object into a Studio Display Glyph, you'll notice that it has anchors around the perimeter of that object, so these blue squares. Those anchors are going to allow you to resize and reposition that particular object. If you click once again on the object, you'll see a red box is going to appear around it, and that would allow you to manipulate its property. You can right-click and select property on that object, and you can also use the toolbar across the top. So this toolbar is the same toolbar if you are already an nCode user that you become familiar with just by using the display glyphs. So for example, if we're dealing with an XY display object inside of Studio of time series data, the properties across the top are going to be identical to the properties, or the tools are going to be identical to what we've seen for an XY display glyph. A couple of other things worth mentioning. If we right-click on an object, go to Properties here, we're going to see a dialog box like this. This is also the same dialog box we've seen for an XY display glyph. This is just going to allow us to control even more properties than what we see on the toolbar across the top. And that's going to be things like the color of the background, the border, display background color, etc. On this same contextual menu, we can also select Edit. It's just one more location where we can access various properties to control the way our objects look. And here you can see a split window where we have a tree structure on the left, the number of objects in this tree structure, and then we have names of properties on the right and their values as well. So if you prefer, you can go in here and then you could change the background color by defining the RGB numbers. All right, so we've configured our objects. We've gotten them to look the way we want them to look. We've positioned them where we want them to be in our report. And the next step will be to pipe our data into the paths associated with those objects. Now you may have noticed that as you bring out an object like an XY display of time series data, there will be a squiggly line in there. It's simply fictitious data that's intended to act as a placeholder so you can graphically get an idea as to how that is going to look. We are going to pipe our raw string gauge data in this example. So we're going to go directly to our time series input glyph, all the way to this pad right here. And as soon as we mouse over this pad, you're going to notice that a green box is going to appear around the object associated with that pad. It's perhaps not as critical in this particular example here, but as soon as you have a number of display objects in the Studio report, there might be a number of them that are looking for time series data. There might be a number of them looking for histogram data. It can get a little bit confusing, so this is just a nice visual indicator as to which object is associated with which pad. And we will then complete that pipe by clicking on this pad, and we're then ready to run the process. So once you've connected all your pipes, you run the process, and all of these display objects will then be updated and display graphically for you what has just been processed in these analysis clips. All right, so we've talked a bit about configuring. our process, let's talk about a couple of extra things as well. The first thing that I'd like to mention is making use of metadata. When I do a demonstration, I'm going to make use of metadata to control the name of the report file, but we have the ability to also use metadata inside of text boxes. So for the text display, you can see an example, the first example right here where my mouse cursor is. We have intentionally put in some static text, and we also have a few lines in here that contain static text as well as information describing metadata. So here is an example of metadata that is a user-defined piece of metadata. It might be, if you've tried this before, that the user has used a metadata generator to create a piece of metadata called test engineer. This is something that they could then populate. We've also got a couple of other lines in here that contains metadata which is available by default in our time series data. So to start with, we've got information describing the channel number, the channel title, Y units, max, min, mean values, as well as the Y units again here. And as soon as we pipe our data into what would be a gray pad associated with this text display and run the process, the metadata names will be replaced with the actual value. Now the benefit here is we can create a process that we would intend to be a standard process, a container report. The report could be generated every time we select the Run button, but our test data may vary from day to day. We may have different channel numbers, different channel titles, and most certainly some of the numerical values in terms of the maximum and minimum values in our channel data is going to be different as well. So this prevents us from having to manually type in this kind of information. It could be very tedious if you had to create lots of reports, or perhaps reports with lots of pages. So a nice, intelligent way to really control what is going to be displayed in your metadata and make it very data-centric. One more topic that I want to cover, kind of a special use case topic. We have the ability to create tables inside of our Studio Display Glyph. Here is an example right here. And that table is going to come from multi-column data. You can see that we have this multi-column input pad that is associated with that particular table. Now, there are two display glyphs. It's the metadata display glyph and also the data value display glyph that can show tabular data. And to an extent, we also have the ability to format that tabular data within both of those display glyphs. So here we can see some histogram data is being displayed in a table inside of our data value display glyph. I could go in here and control, for example, the number of significant digits that we're going to carry. I can control how the leftmost column and also the header column across the top is going to be displayed. By default, we're looking at bin center values, but you may prefer to do something more like min-max values of each of the bins. And that is all going to be controlled inside the data value display. So think of this glyph right here as a tool that we can use to get our tabular data in the right format. It also has a special property inside that allows us to turn on an output pad. So you can see this may look new to some of you guys. You may have used the data value display, but you didn't know it had this capability. We can output this multi-column data further, and in this case, it's going to be sent to our Studio display. So I'll actually do a short little demonstration of something similar to this for you guys when we get into the demonstration. All right, let's talk a little bit about exporting. So we have put together our Studio report. We have the intention of sharing this report, quite possibly with people who are not nCode users. So we want to be able to save this in a file format that they can view without the need to open up a session of nCode and run the process on their own. And the different file types are listed right here. So we can save our files, our report files, as images. We can save them as HTML files, Word documents, PowerPoint documents, PDFs, and also XML files. The export button is towards the top on your toolbar. You can click and hold your mouse button down on that for just a moment, and that is denoted by having this little black down arrow, and that's then going to bring up this drop-down menu, and you can then choose the file format you wish to output your report in. All right, so you click on one of these, and then you're going to start walking through a wizard. The first thing that you will see in this wizard is a property dialog box like this. It's going to ask you to choose what color depth you would like to use, because we're actually going to be taking a screen grab of your report and pasting that into one of the different file formats you've selected. You can choose the pixels per inch that you wish to use. And then as we go a little bit further down, you're going to see some options here, particularly on looping. So we have a number of ways which we can set up a report. It might be that you have a test with just a few channels, and you set it up so that all channels are displayed on a single page. In an example like that, we really don't have the intention to loop on our channels, and therefore you would leave this unchecked. It is also possible that you could have a test with many strain gauge channels in it, and you'd like to create some type of summary report that talks about a single strain gauge per page. So what we would do in that case is we would check this box here, and then as the report is being generated, we are going to put a single strain gauge on a single page. Thus, your Word document or your report is going to have as many pages as we have channels. Let's talk a little bit more about our exporting capabilities. We can export these manually. That's essentially the process I described on the previous slide, where we run the process, and once we run the process, we go to the export button and then choose which file format we want to use and walk through the wizard. We also have the ability to create these reports in a more automated fashion. We could, for example, go into the properties of the studio display, and you can see those right here, and then begin to define various properties. The first one you'd want to define is this one right here. It's called Output Option, and by default it's set to None. However, you could change that to Export. You're then going to choose the export type. In this case, I've selected Microsoft Word. And then you'll probably want to use something smart, like a piece of metadata in the export file name. So this is going to show up blank by default, but what we can do is assign a piece of metadata to the file name. In this case, I'm using the metadata that describes the file name of the original time series file that's being used in our process. What this is going to allow us to do is eventually drag multiple time series input glyphs or inputs onto our input glyph, hit the run button, process multiple tests, which may have multiple channels. Each test is going to be a document of its own. The document is going to be named the same as its original file name, and they may also contain multiple pages, depending on how we've decided to loop on those channels. So making use of metadata in places like the properties here is going to be very powerful. So let me go ahead and share with you my nCode environment and do a demonstration for you. So hopefully everybody can see my nCode session. And what I would like to do is go ahead and just drag some time series data out onto my workspace. I have some time series data which happens to contain 5 channels of strain gauge data. I'll make this just a little bit larger there. And just to add a little bit of variety to this, I'm going to grab a rainflow cycle counting glyph. That's going to be on the basic DSP glyph palette. Let's scroll down and grab that one. This is going to allow me just to put a couple of extra things on the report. And now what I'm going to do is actually grab the studio display glyph. So let's grab the display glyph palette here, bring a studio display glyph out. And let me go ahead and enlarge this. It tends to make things a little bit easier. We'll make this larger. I'm going to right-click in this white space. I already know ahead of time that I'd prefer for this to be in a landscape mode. Let me go ahead and check that box. and then we'll just do a zoom to page. Get this guy enlarged as best we can. All right. I would like to see on this particular studio display a couple of different objects. One object is just going to show me my raw strain gauge data. I'm going to have an object to show a histogram of my rainfall cycle counted data. And why not also put in a table that contains my rainfall cycle counted data. So let's go ahead and right-click once again. I'm going to insert an XY display of time series data. By default, it shows the first 4 fictitious channels here. I'm going to change that to just 1. I want to create a report that has a single channel per page. So I'm just going to use these tools across the top and change that to 1. I'm also going to shrink this just a little bit and resize it and drag it up into my corner. I'm going to create one more object. That's going to be the histogram display. We can drag that into the upper right corner. Make it just a little bit smaller here. And then lastly, I'm going to create a table at the bottom half of the page. So right-click one last time. I'm going to insert table. And we'll drag that down to the lower half and also make it just a bit wider since I'm going to have a few more columns. All right, so just to keep things reasonable, I'm going to change the bin size of my rainfall counting so that we don't have a gigantic table on our page with really small numbers. Let's go ahead and just do something fairly coarse. Should work for our demonstration here. I'm going to do bins of 8 and 8 for the range and mean. And now what I need to do is start piping my data in here. So I'm going to bring my time series data over there. You can see the green box has appeared around it. I'm going to bring my histogram data to my 3D histogram. Again, green box appears around that one. And then my multi-column pad for my histogram data needs to come from a data value display. So I actually need to bring one more glyph out onto my workspace. Let me go ahead and grab that. I'm going to drop a data value display onto the histogram output. And I'm also going to make a couple of changes to the properties of my data value display. So let me double click on its banner. And the first thing that I would like to do is scroll down and change this export type to output pipe. In fact, that's really all I need to do in this example here. Select the OK button, and you will see that we now have a multi-column output pad that can be attached there. Make this just a bit larger. And at this point, we're ready to run our process. So let me go ahead and hit the run button. And now what we see is the display objects inside of my studio display glyph have been updated to show my real data. So I've got my strain gauge data here, my raw strain gauge data. I have my histogram display as well as a table of my histogram displayed here. Now, at this point, I could, if I wanted to, manually create a report. So I'm going to make sure that my studio display glyph is highlighted. We see some tools across the top. This last one right here is my export tool. I'm going to go ahead and click on that one, show you the drop-down menu. This is where I could click on Microsoft Word. But what I want to do instead in this example is set it up automatically. I'm going to do a second example in just a moment where I do it manually. So to do this automatically, I need to go into the properties of my studio display. Let me go ahead and double-click here. I'm going to go to this Advanced tab. The first thing that I want to do is change my output option to export. That's going to allow this report to be generated whenever I hit the run button. I'm going to choose an export type. In this case, I'm going to choose a Word document. And then here's where I'm going to give it a piece of metadata. I'm going to do this because in just a moment, I'm going to drop a second test onto my time series input glyph with the intention of processing multiple tests. So let me put in a piece of metadata here. And there we go. Put in the value of test name. And if we scroll a little bit further down, you can see the other properties that you would otherwise have been defining had you been walking through the wizard. Things like what type of image format are we going to be doing our screen grabs in? What is the color depth? How many pixels per inch? What are we going to do in terms of creating captions and an index page, those types of things. And also, is this going to go into a new document, or would it go into an existing Word document that we had previously set up as a template? So we're going to just leave those as they are, select the OK button. And what I'm going to do now is grab just a second test here. I'm going to drop it on top of my time series input glyph. You'll notice down in the lower corner of that glyph it says 2 tests. And if I hit the run button now, we see the red light is on for quite a bit inside of the studio display. That's because not only is it processing both of my tests and all the channels of my test, but it is spooling images to be pasted into that Word document. And that Word document is now ready for me. Let me go ahead and open up the directory. This happens to be work example number 10. These work examples come with the installation of the software. I've just been working with existing sample data. And we can see our 2 Word documents here. So let me go ahead and open up the first one. And it's not the most elegant report because I didn't spend any time in terms of arranging my objects so that they line up nice and neatly. But what you can see is that I have a page here for the first channel in my measured data. If I scroll down, I have a page for my second channel, my third and fourth, and then finally my 5th channel. I can go back into that same directory. I can open up this one right here. So here's the Word document. It's been named the same name as the time series file that ultimately started this data. And here's that second test report, also containing 5 documents inside of that, or 5 pages within that report document. All right, let me go ahead and minimize this. And what I want to do now is clear out my workspace, and I'm going to open up an existing report, actually an existing process that has a report already built inside of it, just so that you guys can see what a meter report would look like. And this one is part of work example 10, so you guys can open this up on your own as well. What I'm going to do is drag some of my string gauge data into this input glyph. We've got a few more glyphs here that are going to perform analysis on my measured data. I'm going to select the run button. And now we have completed the run. So what we're looking at is just one page that happens to be the first channel of 5 channels in our measured data. And if I wanted to, I can highlight my studio display glyph and now export manually with this wizard right here. So I will, in fact, output all my channels. If I didn't do this, I would only see a single page in my report. I'm going to select the OK button, and hang on, let me back up just one second. I want to do this as a Word document. So let me press and hold for just a moment and choose Word instead of an image. There we go. We will do a new document, and let's go ahead and give it a name. We'll give it something different so that we can, in fact, see that it's been created. We will output all of our channels. Select the OK button. Here is a dialog box that's asking us what we would like to do in terms of including an index page, what would we like to include in terms of captions. These are the same properties that we saw in the property dialog box of the Studio Display glyph when we were setting up our report generation automatically. I'm going to leave these just as they are in their default configuration. And now we are spooling those images to a Word document. So we can go back to our work example 10 directory. And we now see that we have a Word doc called sample. This is our newly created report. And this one as well has 5 pages. A little bit more information on these pages though, because there's a few more display objects inside of that. All right, so let me go ahead and minimize this. And let's jump back into our PowerPoint material and wrap things up and see what's left in terms of some closing remarks. So just in summary, what we've seen are a couple of demonstrations of using the Studio Display Glyph. The ultimate objective for this Glyph is to create a neat and professional-looking reports that can then be exported into some file format that a lot of users can, or a lot of people could read. We've got a lot of options in terms of how we can format all of the objects, how we can format the page, and we have quite a few options on how we can export the report as well. So highly customizable. And then just lastly, it's worth mentioning that work example 10, there is a step-by-step procedure, instructions that you can follow. Let me go ahead and jump into nCode and I'll show you where that can be accessed. So over on the far left, if you've not used these at all before, you can go to Manuals. You can open up this third PDF document down. It's titled GlyphWorks Examples. And if you scroll down on the left-hand edge to number 10 in the table of content, you can then quickly navigate to an example where we have step-by-step instructions on using some of the sample data that you've seen me use in the demonstration, and then creating a report that shows information about that example data. All right, so with that, what I would like to do is open things up for